Title: Shadows in the Fog. Chapter 1: The Arrival. Jack Mercer arrived in Blackwood Hollow just as the fog began to roll in. He had come for a quiet retreat, a chance to work on his next book without distractions. But the moment he stepped into the small town, he felt it: something was wrong. The air was thick, heavy with an eerie silence, and the townspeople cast nervous glances toward the encroaching mist. "Stay inside at night," the motel owner warned as she handed Jack his key. "The fog, it's not normal." Jack brushed off the warning, thinking it was just small-town superstition. But that night, as he sat by the window, he heard something, a whispering voice calling his name from the swirling mist outside. Chapter 2: Vanishing Shadows. By morning, the town was abuzz with fear. A man named Ethan Miller had gone missing overnight. His truck was found abandoned on the main road, the driver's side door hanging open. No tracks. No signs of struggle. Just the fog, thick as ever. Jack, ever the skeptic, decided to investigate. He wandered into the woods where Ethan was last seen. As he moved deeper, the air grew colder, the trees twisted unnaturally. And then, movement. A shadow within the fog. "Ethan!" Jack called. The shadow lunged. Chapter 3: The Watchers. Jack barely escaped, stumbling back to town, his breath ragged. The sheriff, a grizzled man named Reynolds, wasn't surprised. "You saw them, didn't you?" Reynolds muttered. "Saw what?" Jack demanded. Reynolds looked past him, into the fog creeping along the street. "The Watchers. They take people." Jack scoffed. "You really believe that?" Reynolds met his gaze, his face grim. "Believe? Son, I've seen it. And if you're smart, you'll leave before they come for you too." Several chapters develop Jack's investigation, encounters with the townsfolk, and chilling disappearances. The town's pets vanish, strange voices call from the fog, and shadows stalk the streets. Chapter 13: The Rescue That Came Too Late. Emily stood frozen on the street, the weight of the town's eerie normalcy pressing on her chest. She knew what had happened. She knew Jack had been swallowed whole by the fog, and yet, no one else seemed to care, or even remember. A sudden commotion snapped her out of her daze. From the far end of the street, near the old bakery, a blood-curdling scream tore through the air. A woman bolted from the alleyway, cradling her arm. Blood dripped between her fingers. "My dog! It bit me," she sobbed, staggering forward. It wasn't my dog anymore." Sheriff Reynolds and a couple of officers rushed toward her, guns drawn. The dog, a massive German shepherd, emerged from the mist-choked alley, its eyes glowing an unnatural yellow. Its mouth foamed, teeth bared, but it didn't growl, it was whispering. A low, raspy murmur that slithered through the air like a ghostly chant. Reynolds fired. The bullet hit, but the dog didn't stop. It lunged at another pedestrian, a young man who barely managed to jump out of the way before the beast twisted unnaturally, its body convulsing as if something inside was trying to rip free. Then, the fog moved. From the alley, shapes appeared, twisted, elongated figures with vacant faces. The police fired again, but it was useless. The mist thickened, swallowing sound and light, creeping closer with every second. "Get back!" Reynolds roared, dragging the bitten woman toward his squad car. "Get inside, now!" Emily turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. Behind her, people screamed. The dog's whispers grew louder, more insidious. She didn't stop to look back. Chapter 14: Fire in the Fog. Sirens wailed through the town as more officers and firefighters flooded the streets. The fog had begun to spread, curling through alleyways, slithering under doors. People pounded on their windows, screaming for help. The fire department was the last line of defense. Chief Harris, a hardened man who had seen his fair share of disasters, barked orders as his crew fought to control the chaos. "Get the kids and women out first," he shouted. "We need to contain this damn thing." The firefighters smashed through doors, pulling terrified families from their homes, carrying children in their arms as they sprinted toward the safety of the station. The police set up barricades, but it was pointless. The fog was not something they could keep out. In the center of it all, Emily saw a mother clutching her baby, trapped on the steps of the library as the fog coiled around her. Without thinking, Emily ran forward, grabbing the woman's arm and yanking her free just as the fog surged forward, snapping like the jaws of a beast. "Come on!" Emily gasped, dragging her through the streets, past firefighters hacking at the mist with axes, past police officers shouting orders that no one could follow. Explosions rang out. A gas line had ruptured, igniting a burst of fire. For a moment, the flames seemed to push back the fog, sending the shadows shrieking. But it wasn't enough. Emily knew. It was never enough. Chapter 15, The Ones Left Behind. The survivors gathered at the fire station, their eyes wild with fear. The bitten woman lay on a stretcher, sweating and convulsing. Her veins pulsed black beneath her skin. "She needs a doctor," one of the officers muttered. "But Doc Miller, he's gone." Emily swallowed hard. The fog had taken him weeks ago. Chief Harris paced the room. "We need to evacuate the town." "No," Sheriff Reynolds said firmly. "We don't run." "Then what the hell do you suggest?" Harris snapped. "That thing is eating the town alive." Reynolds was silent for a long moment before he finally spoke. "We fight it. Whatever it is." Emily knew it was useless. She had seen the truth. Jack was gone. And soon, they would be too. Chapter 16, The Final Stand. The station lights flickered. A low hum resonated through the walls, vibrating the very air they breathed. The bitten woman let out a strangled gasp, her eyes turned pitch black, her skin darkening as veins bulged. She sat up abruptly. "They're here," she whispered, her voice layered with something inhuman. The doors burst open. The fog rushed in, carrying with it the shadows, the watchers. Their elongated limbs stretched unnaturally as they crawled through the thick mist. The police opened fire, but the bullets passed through them like smoke. Screams filled the station as the fog swallowed those too slow to run. Emily grabbed a flare gun from the emergency kit and fired into the mass. The red glow lit the creatures, revealing faces, horribly stretched and familiar. Jack. Ethan. Doc Miller. They were part of it now. A deafening roar echoed through the station. The shadows shrieked and recoiled from the fire. It was their only weapon. With no time to think, Emily turned to Reynolds and Harris. "We have to burn it all down." And with that, the fight for Blackwood Hollow truly began. Chapter 17, Into the Flames. The fire crackled, a desperate beacon in the encroaching fog. Emily, Reynolds, and Harris gathered what little they could, guns, flares, anything that might give them a chance. The remaining survivors huddled near the fire station, their faces pale, eyes wide with terror. The fog had almost consumed the town entirely, and they could hear the low murmurs of the watchers just beyond the flames. Emily's heart raced. There was no turning back now. This was it, the last stand for Blackwood Hollow. "We set the town on fire," Reynolds said, his voice low and grim. "We burn it all. We make them pay." Harris nodded, his face lined with determination. "We light the whole damn place up. Nothing stays, nothing but ashes." Emily grabbed a gasoline can, her hands shaking as she poured it over the nearby street. The thick fog twisted around them, like a living thing, and she swore she could hear it whispering her name. She didn't stop. "Light it," Reynolds ordered. Emily took a match from her pocket and struck it. The flame flickered for a heartbeat before she tossed it onto the gasoline-soaked street. The fire shot up, bright and hot, casting long shadows across the fog. For a moment, it seemed to fight back, but the fire spread quickly, devouring the streets in an inferno. The fog recoiled, as if the flames were its only true enemy. But it wasn't enough. The watchers didn't retreat. Instead, they emerged from the mist, their faces twisted in grotesque mockeries of the people they had once been. Jack. Ethan. Doc Miller. They walked through the flames like they weren't there, their eyes hollow, their movements jerky and unnatural. "We have to fight them," Emily said, her voice shaking. "We'll try," Reynolds said, his jaw set. "But we can't kill them. Not like this." The watchers stopped at the edge of the flames, their heads tilted as if watching the survivors. Their twisted forms loomed larger with each passing second, their eyes glowing bright in the firelight. The air grew heavy again, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They were getting closer. "Not now," Harris muttered, raising his gun. "We need to push them back." The first shot rang out. Chapter 18, The War for Blackwood Hollow. The battle raged through the night. The survivors fought with everything they had, guns, flares, anything that could push back the fog and the creatures that came with it. Each flare shot into the night, illuminating the watchers as they advanced, unrelenting. But no matter how many times they shot or struck, the creatures couldn't be stopped. They fought like shadows, bending and warping around the survivors' attacks. Emily's hands were slick with sweat as she reloaded her gun. The fog crept closer, swallowing the streets inch by inch. The town was burning, but the creatures didn't care. They kept coming. "Get to the church," Reynolds shouted. "We need to hold them there, if we can." They ran, the fire crackling behind them as the town of Blackwood Hollow continued to burn. Emily's breath was ragged, and her heart thundered in her chest. The church was the highest building left, a place where they might stand a chance. But the fog, it wasn't just creeping anymore. It was pressing, alive with something darker, stronger. When they reached the church, they slammed the doors shut, barricading themselves inside. The stained glass windows rattled as the fog pressed against them, but they held firm. "We can't stay here forever," Harris said, his voice strained. Emily looked around at the remaining survivors. A handful of people had made it, but the rest, they were gone. "We're running out of time," Reynolds muttered, gripping his weapon tight. And then, the whispers started again. Soft at first, like a distant wind, but then louder, clearer. She could hear them, the voices, growing ever closer. They weren't alone in the church. Chapter 19, The Final Hour. The clock above the altar ticked down, the minutes slipping away. The church grew colder, and the fog outside thickened, blocking out the world. Emily felt the air growing oppressive as the whispers surrounded them. "I don't think we can fight them anymore," Emily said quietly, her voice breaking. "They've already won." Reynolds glanced at her, his face hard. "Don't say that. We've come too far." But Emily wasn't so sure. She could hear the voices, Jack's, Ethan's, Doc Miller's, calling her name, urging her to join them in the fog. It was hard to resist. So hard. But she held her ground, shaking her head. "I won't go," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was saying it to herself or to the fog itself. The air grew denser, the whispers growing louder until they were all-encompassing. Then, with a deafening crash, the church doors burst open, the fog pouring inside like a tidal wave. And that's when Emily knew. There was no escape. The watchers had come for them all. Chapter 20, The Fog Creeps In. The church doors slammed open, the fog pouring in like a living thing, writhing and twisting around their feet. The temperature dropped instantly, the air so cold that their breath turned to ice in front of them. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices, rising in pitch, calling out, pleading, mocking. "Emily," the voice was soft, almost tender, but twisted. It sounded like Jack, but it wasn't Jack. "Come to us. You're one of us now." Emily's blood ran cold. Her eyes darted around the room, but all she could see was the fog, thickening and darkening, swallowing the church in its depths. She felt the air grow heavier, suffocating. The floor beneath her feet seemed to shift, groaning as though it were alive. The wooden pews creaked, the walls seemed to pulse with each breath she took. The others backed away, pressing themselves against the cold stone walls, their eyes wide with panic. "They're inside," Reynolds said, his voice ragged, panicked. "They've—" Before he could finish, the ground beneath them trembled. The floorboards cracked, and Emily stumbled, nearly losing her footing. The whispers seemed to curl around her like tendrils, pulling her toward the fog. The temperature plunged, and the shadows in the corners of the room shifted unnaturally. "I can't breathe," one of the survivors whispered, clutching their chest. Reynolds tried to fire his gun into the fog, but the shot went wide, the bullet dissipating like smoke, swallowed by the mist. "What the hell?" Harris muttered. "It's like it's absorbing everything." The fog began to move faster, snaking across the floor, up the walls, closing in. It spread from the doors, curling in on itself as though it had a mind of its own. Emily backed up, every instinct screaming at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. And then, they heard it. A slow, dragging sound, like feet scraping across the floor. The church's thick wooden doors slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside. The whispers stopped. The silence was worse. And then, those eyes. Out of the mist, two glowing yellow orbs appeared, hovering just above the floor, sinking into the fog. They hovered in place for a moment, then moved, slowly, deliberately, toward the group. The shape they belonged to began to materialize in the mist. First, the outline of a figure. A person, no, something, its features twisting and warping, a silhouette of horror. It was tall, too tall, its limbs stretched out at unnatural angles. And then its face appeared, an elongated, hollow expression, grinning with jagged teeth that seemed to stretch impossibly wide. The thing whispered Emily's name. Her knees nearly buckled as the air around her grew heavier. She could feel it watching her, could feel its hunger. "It's him," Harris gasped. "Jack. That's Jack. But it's not Jack. He shook his head, unable to finish his thought. The creature stepped forward, its legs unnaturally long and twisted, dragging itself through the fog like something out of a nightmare. Each step seemed to reverberate through the church, shaking the walls. Emily couldn't move. She wanted to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. The watcher, Jack, reached out a long, pale hand toward her, its fingers stretching inhumanly long. The whispers around them grew louder, becoming a constant buzz in her ears. She could feel the pull, the desire to step forward, to join it, to give in. "No!" Reynolds shouted, stepping forward, gun aimed at the creature. "Stay back!" He fired. The bullet hit the watcher square in the chest, but it did nothing. The thing just stared. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the watcher took another step forward, its head tilting, the grin on its face widening in a way that shouldn't be possible. "You can't stop it," the creature whispered, its voice now Jack's, but twisted and wrong. "We take what's ours." The temperature in the room dropped further, and the shadows that filled the church walls seemed to shift, moving of their own accord. The watcher reached out again, its hand now inches from Emily's face. A cold, hollow laugh echoed from the creature as its fingers brushed against her cheek, sending an icy shock through her body. Her legs went numb, her vision blurred, and she felt herself being pulled toward it, like a marionette on invisible strings. "No! Stop!" Harris yelled, his voice full of desperation. The watcher didn't react. It couldn't react. It wasn't even alive anymore. It was part of the fog, a creature born from its depths. And then it happened. The woman who had been standing near the altar, her face pale and frozen in fear, screamed as the fog coiled around her, dragging her forward. She was pulled into the mist, her body jerking violently, as though something inside her was being ripped apart. "No!" Reynolds cried, but it was too late. The watcher turned its attention to the next victim, reaching for another of the survivors. But Emily didn't wait. She snapped out of the trance-like pull, her body moving before her brain could catch up. She grabbed the flare gun and fired it into the fog. The flare shot out with a deafening crack, and for a moment, the church was lit in harsh red light. The watcher screeched, a sound so high-pitched that it made her ears ring. It recoiled from the light, its form flickering in and out of existence. But the fog wasn't finished. The watchers kept coming, pouring into the church from all directions. It was too late for them. They were surrounded. Chapter 21, Into the Abyss. The watchers, their faces now a grotesque blend of the missing townsfolk, closed in from all sides. Their movements were erratic, limbs snapping into unnatural positions, their eyes glowing with a hunger that had no end. Emily felt the cold creeping deeper into her bones. It was no longer just the temperature, it was the creeping sense of despair, of nothingness. This was what they had been waiting for, they were the final pieces. The town of Blackwood Hollow wasn't just a place, it was a trap, a prison for whatever lurked in the fog. She glanced at Reynolds and Harris, their faces grim, knowing the end was near. It was already too late for most of them. "Run," Reynolds hissed, his voice cracking. But it was too late for that. The watchers were already upon them, their hands long and skeletal, pulling them into the fog, one by one. Emily screamed, the sound echoing in the darkness as she was swallowed by the mist. The last thing she saw before the world went black was the grinning face of Jack, twisted beyond recognition, his hollow eyes filled with an eternal hunger. And then, silence. Chapter 22, The Last Breath. Emily's lungs burned. She couldn't breathe, couldn't escape. The fog was suffocating, wrapping around her like an invisible hand, pulling her deeper into the void. Her mind raced, but there was no clarity, only the overwhelming presence of the watchers, their twisted faces looming in the mist. They were everywhere. Watching. Waiting. She stumbled, her feet unsteady beneath her as the cold penetrated deeper, seeping into her bones. The air was thick, oppressive, and the fog was alive. It moved, it twisted, it grew. "Emily," the whisper was soft, like Jack's voice, but wrong, so wrong. Her pulse quickened. She spun around, but saw only darkness and shapes shifting in the mist, their forms stretching and warping into things that should never exist. The walls of the church, if it had ever been the church, were now nothing more than decaying remnants, twisted pillars and collapsing beams lost within the fog. A laugh echoed in the air, cold and hollow. It was the same laugh she had heard earlier. The watchers were here, and they were not alone. The ground beneath her feet buckled. A deep, resonating rumble. Emily stumbled forward, arms flailing as she tried to regain her balance, but the floor was crumbling. The watchers took a step forward, their eyes glowing brighter in the swirling darkness. "Help me," a voice cried out from behind her. It wasn't Jack's voice this time. It was another, a man, a woman, or perhaps both. All of them. Emily spun, trying to catch a glimpse of the person, or thing, that had called out. But the fog had grown thicker, faster. The shapes were moving closer now, their faces distorting into unrecognizable horrors. She could barely make out their outlines, only their eyes like hollow pits, their yellow glow flickering in the darkness. And then, the hands. They reached out from the fog, long and skeletal, their fingers like claws, wrapping around her legs, pulling her down. Emily screamed, her body yanked backward with terrifying strength. The fog closed in, swallowing her with a suffocating embrace. Her world became a whirl of cold, whispers, and a feeling of falling. As if she was being dragged into a bottomless abyss, pulled into something far darker than she could comprehend. She clawed at the air, but her hands passed through it like smoke. She screamed, but no sound came. There was only the endless murmur of the watchers, their voices blending together in an unintelligible chant, a song of madness. The ground disappeared beneath her feet, and suddenly, Emily was no longer standing. She was falling. Faster. Deeper. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't feel her limbs. She reached out, desperate, her fingers touching nothing but the cold emptiness. The fog surrounded her, and she realized with a horrible clarity that it wasn't just consuming her, it was taking her soul, pulling her into it. And then, just as everything seemed to fade to black, a face appeared. Jack's face. But it wasn't Jack. Not anymore. His eyes glowed, hollow and empty. His lips parted into a grin that stretched too wide, showing sharp, jagged teeth. He leaned forward, his voice a hollow rasp. "You're one of us now." And then, the darkness took her. Chapter 23, The Echoes of Blackwood Hollow. The fog in Blackwood Hollow remained, thick and impenetrable. Days passed, then weeks. The town, once vibrant with life, was now a ghost town, a graveyard for the forgotten, where only the watchers remained. The last of the survivors had been claimed by the fog, swallowed whole by the shadows. The few who had tried to escape were lost, never to be seen again. The watchers were patient. They waited. They fed on the souls of the living, adding them to the twisted army that roamed the streets. No one came looking for Blackwood Hollow. No one knew it even existed. And the fog never left. Epilogue, the town that never was. Years later, a curious traveler stumbled upon the remnants of Blackwood Hollow. The air was thick with an unnatural mist. The old roads were cracked and overgrown with vines, and the buildings stood like decaying sentinels, swallowed by time. They called it the haunted town. But as the traveler ventured closer to the heart of Blackwood Hollow, something in the air shifted. The whispers were faint at first, so faint they could have been imagined. But they weren't. The watchers were still there. And they were waiting. The end, or perhaps, just the beginning.